We had very contentious issues in my constituency when I was a Dáil TD, very often exploited by people for electoral gain. And I always
no shortages in Fianna Fáíl.
And I always stood, well, I'm in Fianna Fáíl too, and I always stood four square in support of asylum seekers, refugees, and ensuring that when they came to our shores, that we would try and accommodate them.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 132 of Here's How for the 7th of April 2022. There's no rant this week as William has a cold and is not in his best ranting voice. He'd like me to thank all of the donors on Patreon. Patreon is a web service that allows you to donate €1 or €2 per podcast or per month, and that helps us to devote more time to research topics and to finding interesting guests for the podcasts. If you think you could do the same as those donors, there's details on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
On the line, I have Billy Kelleher. He was Fianna Fáil's only MEP from when he was elected in 2019 for the South constituency until he was joined from the subs bench by Barry Andrews after Brexit. Before that, he served from 1993 in the Seanad and from 1997 in the Dáil and was a minister in various capacities from 2007 until Fianna Fáil left office in 2011. Billy, you've been commenting a lot on the war in Ukraine and Ireland's correct role in the world. First of all, what are your thoughts on the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Well, it's illegal and is causing huge catastrophic humanitarian problems. It certainly shows that we were fooled by Russia for many, many years in the West, that is, by the fact that they were almost, portraying the view that they would never invade, that they weren't belligerent, that they were a benign force. And, a lot of the publicity and the social media content that was coming from Russia was very much of that tone, that it was the West was a belligerent, that it was NATO was undermining peace. But at the same time, it was very clear that Russia had its eyes on Ukraine. It invaded Ukraine in 2014, took Crimea. It has been interfering in Luhansk and Donetsk since then, recognizing two republics recently. So, it has been doing this for a long time under the very open guise, and yet the West was asleep in terms of how we viewed Russia as a benign partner.
Was everyone asleep?
I think the vast majority of us were, being truthful. If you look at even the Nord Stream, for example, and the pipeline from Russia to Germany, there was always strong business connections between Germany and Russia in recent years. But I think that overall, the European Council, NATO itself, individual member states certainly took their eye off the ball in terms of the potential threat that Russia could be, and we were quite happy to let them meddle in the affairs in Georgia, as I said, in Ukraine. And when you look around now with the benefit of hindsight, they were involved in Syria at a very high level. They had been.
When you say involved, you mean bombing people?
Yes, militarily very involved, and yet no sanction really taken for their activities there. No sanctions taken when they invaded Crimea, when they invaded Georgia, when they started to dismantle the eastern provinces of Ukraine. No sanction taken. In effect, we were still giving President Putin absolution, and we were still doing business with Russia. In fact, we were reinforcing our reliance on Russia. Around the issue of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and, purchasing more gas from Russia, making your own economies more dependent on Russia. So I think in general, the entire European Union, the member states that make it up, and NATO, which is an umbrella military organization for many countries that are also members of the European Union, certainly didn't take the threat seriously, even though it was in broad daylight it was happening.
Okay, I just want to play for you a short clip from your constituency colleague, Mick Wallace. 8 days before the invasion of Ukraine, he stood up in the European Parliament and said this.
We've had 3 months of this farce now, and the line between the real and the imaginary is blurred. The US and the UK have used their media to flood pages, screens and airwaves with a load of unsubstantiated fear-mongering and lies gleaned from unaccountable, anonymous sources in the intelligence community. This has reached such a pitch that when Ukraine begs the US and NATO to stop creating hysteria and to provide some proof for the supposedly imminent any day now Russian invasion, Ukraine is ignored by the forces that pretend to protect them. The warmongering of NATO and the US these past few months has done nothing for peace in Europe. People who want peace in Europe should be calling for NATO to be abolished.
What's your thoughts on that, Billy?
Well, that particular piece didn't age too well. I mean, within a matter of days of that, Russia had invaded Ukraine. Ukraine was never a military threat to Russia. It never indicated that it was going to annex any part of Russia. And, let's be very honest. I mean, NATO did expand eastwards. It expanded eastwards when the wall was dismantled in 1989, where that was the Iron Curtain fell apart. And you had a lot of new independent countries that were democratic in their outlook that applied to join NATO. So countries scrambled to join NATO: Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, and many others along the eastern flank. And they joined NATO. And of course, we should know why they did, because any cursory examination of history would show that Russia, being the dominant partner in the USSR, was an oppressive regime in terms of how they dealt with Hungary, how they dealt with Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, right across the entire region. Russia has always been a very aggressive force, undermining human rights, undermining basic principles and freedoms, and it is run now by a dictator, but even in the previous times when it was under the USSR, it was still dictatorial in terms of its outlook. So that's why they joined. They joined because they have had experience of continued Russian aggression and oppression, and we should have listened to them more when they were telling us over the last number of years that they were concerned about Russia's buildup of a military capability, about the fact that it was in Syria, practicing its maneuvers, using Syria as a training ground for its pilots and for its bombing campaign. So we should have listened to them, but we didn't. And we were always hopeful that the big Russian bear, as such, that was a threat to all these countries over the years, was now a benign, friendly neighbour.
Okay, pause with that, because I want to just run relatively quickly, through some of the things that are happening. And I don't want to try to compete with the news. And obviously, we're in a podcast here and things are moving fairly quickly. But just some of the things that are happening in Ukraine. One that really struck me, the one Ukrainian journalist, her name is Svetlana Zalitska. She's from Melitopol. Her elderly father appears to have been taken hostage by the Russian forces who are in that city. And they have told her that he will only be released when she returns and surrenders to their custody for what they call interrogation. Also in Melitopol, it would appear that the Russians are using what are called fuel-air weapons, which are incredibly powerful and unbelievably cruel weapons, which essentially fill the air over a relatively large area with explosive gas and send an explosive wave, literally pulverizing the internal organs of anybody in that area. And the Russian excuse for this is they say Ukraine is run by neo-Nazi drug addicts and was committing genocide in Donbass, this ethnically Russian province in the far east of Ukraine. How seriously do you take any of that?
Well, I take very seriously the fact that the Russians are using thermobaric bombs. They are targeting civilians. You only have to go a little further south to Mariupol to see what they have done in terms of laying waste an entire city. Kharkiv in the north, which is only 40 kilometers inside the Ukrainian border from Russia, a thriving university city for many years, a place where an awful lot of Russians would have gone for a weekend, strong ties with Russia, where they are systematically destroying the city as we speak, pounding it with heavy artillery on a continual basis. So, I mean, the Russian onslaught is very real, and it is targeting civilians. And if we didn't the Russians have already done this. They did it in Aleppo. They've done it in Grozny. They pound
to be clear,
entire
just for
cities.
all of the listeners might not have your geography skills, Aleppo was the Syrian city that had previously been controlled by rebels who opposed the Assad regime. Grozny was the capital of Chechnya, which is a republic within Russia, but an ethnically separate entity. It's a largely a Muslim republic that went to war essentially for independence and was ground into the dust by the Russians bombing what is technically their own territory. I mean, you're speaking about it obviously in horrified terms. You entirely disapprove of this, and I don't think we need to step through every single one of those. But just in terms of Ireland's response, are you proud of the way that Ireland has dealt with refugees from Ukraine?
Well, I am. I'm very proud of being truthful of the Irish government, the Irish people, and the NGOs that work to try and ensure that Ukrainian refugees, when they come into the European Union, that are dealt with in a humane, decent, dignified way. And from the Irish perspective, we are certainly taking a large number, in proportion to our population. And I very much welcome that, and I hope that we will show a leading light in that. Bear in mind, the humanitarian area is an area where we can offer most. We don't have a large military capability, so we're neutral, so we won't be supporting it in that context. But from the humanitarian point of view, I certainly am very proud of what we're doing today. We could do a little bit more. I certainly think that the Irish Army, in terms of logistics in, we'll say, Poland or in Hungary or Slovakia, might have a role to play when refugees flood in over the border. The Poles are under huge pressure. We do need to support the NGOs that are looking after them, the Red Crosses, for example, and the local authorities in eastern Poland as well, just to support them. That we can then transfer refugees seamlessly from where they entered the European Union to where they need to be. And that's obviously in shelter and accommodation throughout the European Union.
Okay. Then in terms of reaction, Ireland's reaction, what we should do about this, I've got one kind of more long-term question, but in the very, hopefully, short-ish term, do you think that the people who are commanding troops to use thermobaric weapons in urban areas, also using white phosphorus, which is an explicitly prohibited weapon and also clearly a crime under the Geneva Conventions, forcibly deporting civilian populations. Do you think that the people who are authorising that should be tried as war criminals in The Hague?
I do. There's two things I've said about this, and I've looked at this purely from the point of view of what we must do longer term as well. Mm-hmm. There's a war raging. We don't know how long this war will rage. Whether the Ukrainian army and the civilians can hold out, whether there will be peace talks. All of these things are in the future. But I mean, we should certainly, and international organizations should be logging all the offences to date. They should be garnering evidence wherever they can at the moment. And the other issue I feel very strongly about, we can't have a situation where President Putin decides sometime down the road, well, I'm going to withdraw or I'm going to have a peace settlement with the Ukraine, and that we all go back to normality again. Sanctions will have to stay with this appalling regime that is running Russia at the moment. Sanctions will have to stay on Putin and his cronies and the oligarchs and the top brass of the military and those in the top echelons of the public administration and the political administration who are supporting this illegal war. First and foremost, it's illegal. Mm-hmm. And number two, then the war and how it's being prosecuted in Ukrainian soil by targeting civilians, using white phosphorus, using thermobarics, mining civilian areas. Like, there are so many breaches of basic, rules of engagement that there's many war crimes being committed, and people will have to be held accountable.
Okay, and we talk about that in the aftermath of this, but going forward, perhaps into the longer term, you've mentioned on Twitter perhaps changing Ireland's neutral role and potentially moving Ireland into a military role. How do you see that moving forward?
Well, I actually wrote about that in advance of the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. This came about because there was a publication of a commission of a report into the Defence Forces. This was an independent assessment of the Irish Defence Forces in terms of its capabilities, its capacities, what needs to be done to modernise and to streamline it. And it was quite damning from the point of view that we've obviously neglected funding the defence forces for many, many years. So I was observing it from that perspective initially. Clearly, the invasion into the Ukraine is another dynamic altogether. We can have that discussion as well. But like cybersecurity, for example, is something that people maybe don't take seriously enough yet. For example, it happened in the HSE, for example, where there was an attack on the HSE. It effectively caused a huge disruption. That was an attack on an Irish asset, on the Irish state. Now, it came from actors not working for, we'll say, the Russian government, but certainly at their acquiescence, or at least being allowed. I'm saying it certainly by their acquiescence or being allowed to do that. And Russia has been doing that in Ukraine. In Ukraine for many years, it cut off its electricity. It's been closing down water supplies, all by cyber attacks.
Sure, yeah, no, that's what they've been doing. But I'm interested in your thoughts of what Ireland's reaction should be going forward into perhaps the longer term future. In particular, neutrality is something that is held dear by some people. It is perhaps less so by others. Where are you on that?
Yes, well, I certainly believe that we should be non-aligned. That we shouldn't not necessarily join a defence outfit like NATO, for example. But I also believe that Ireland has to have the capability of having a foreign policy that is not dictated to by members of the UN Security Council. So, for example, the 5 countries on the UN Security Council are Russia, China, the United States, France, and the UK. And any one of those 5 countries can use a veto to deny Ireland its right or its entitlement or its want to provide troops for UN peacekeeping, for example. Just
to explain that, because you're very deep into that, and not everybody might have that exact knowledge. There are 15 members, 10 of them are elected in the UN Security Council, which makes these decisions. 10 of them are elected. 5 of them are always there, which are those countries that you mentioned. Russia inherited the seat that was previously held by the Soviet Union. One no vote from even one of those 5 can overrule all 14 other votes. That's essentially the way that works. And Ireland has a policy set down in law that if the UN Security Council doesn't approve a particular action, then Ireland will not participate. So you're saying correctly, in effect, that just one of those 5 has a veto over what Ireland does from a security point of view. But my question is, what might we be doing?
Well, I mean, from now on, we have a situation where if you look at the most recent geopolitical change in the landscape that has definitively changed for the foreseeable future. I mean, Russia is now an aggressor when it comes to our way of life, to European values, to what we believe. So, if Ireland wants to provide peacekeeping troops to any theatre in the world, Russia will have a veto on it. China will have a veto on it. And I just think that we have to move beyond how we decide what we can partake in to at least a General Assembly, whereby a resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations would be enough for Ireland to decide whether or not they wanted to commit troops to peacekeeping. And this is very important. I mean, when people talk about a changed neutrality, there's a view then always being perpetrated, primarily from the left, that all of a sudden Irish armies will be marauding around the world. We are not an aggressive nation. We are a neutral nation at the moment. I'm saying we should not be aligned, but that doesn't mean that we can't take a stand and make decisions. And unfortunately, the way the triple lock is structured, that is the government, the Dáil, and the UN Security Council deciding if a peacekeeping mission is suitable. Is too rigid a check in view of the fact that Russia and China will have a veto on the decisions. So the Irish government could make a decision, it could be approved by the Dáil, and Russia at the moment could be the ones that would stop it. I don't believe for a nation that has contributed so much to peacekeeping should continue to be beholden.
But what I'm trying to get at is, what do you see happening? Can you give me a plausible scenario going forward into the future that in the world that you are advocating, Ireland could intervene in that they perhaps could not now?
Well, I mean, there could be, for example, there's an 11-year civil war in Syria, for example. Russia is intimately involved in that. It's bombing campaign, etc. Supposing there was an intervention and there was a peace process and there had to be peacekeepers deployed. And if Russia was not supportive of that concept, because it has skin in the game, well, then Ireland couldn't commit troops to a UN peacekeeping force. So, I mean, that's a real live potential issue whereby in years to come.
But is that really, Billy? Is that really plausible? If Russia wasn't supporting it, they perhaps are a little bit distracted now, but they could potentially be bombing that. Are you proposing putting Irish troops on the ground underneath Russian warplanes?
No. What I'm saying is, in the event of there being a peacekeeping force deployed, supposing there was a peacekeeping force deployed, if it was under the guise of the European Union, for example, that there was a settlement, there was a peace settlement, no longer military activity, but there needed to be peacekeeping forces deployed, just like they are in other parts of the world. We have deployed troops all over. We have them in Kosovo, we have them in Lebanon, we had them in Congo, we have them in lots of places. We've had a proud tradition of that.
Post-settlement.
Yes, of course, you can't be committing troops in advance of a settlement. I mean,
okay.
we're not deploying troops into a live theatre. I wouldn't be advocating that. That's why I'm saying, we wouldn't be part of NATO. We would be non-aligned, but it would allow us to take positions on issues that we feel strongly about as a government, as a Dáil, and as a people.
Okay. Pause with that idea. Pause with that idea. And you've made that triple lock. Okay, you've made that very clear, and you want to reduce how tightly that lock is locked. But looking at it realistically, the previous real live military engagement, as opposed to peacekeeping, was at least tangentially involving Ireland, was the invasion of Iraq. And during that time, and we listed, and I don't want to go through all of them again, we listed a whole range of activities of Russia in Ukraine that any civilized person would see is grossly improper and should not be happening. It's very difficult to find something that Russia is doing in Ukraine that, for example, our supposed friends, the Americans, were not doing in Iraq. And I mentioned, for example, the holding of hostage of the father of a journalist. Within a month of the Americans invading Iraq in April 2003, they targeted and murdered several journalists, particularly in the Palestine hotel in Baghdad. The Americans claimed at the time that they were coming under fire from that hotel. There was audio recording which disproved that, and it wasn't a coincidence that, as well as blowing up the Al Jazeera's office in Baghdad, they had previously blown up the Al Jazeera's office in Kabul in Afghanistan, because Al Jazeera is seen as a news source, although quite reliable. It's seen as one that's not terribly friendly to the United States. We mentioned the Russians using fuel air bombs, the thermobaric bombs in Melitopol, and also previously in Grozny, which the Americans did in Fallujah, also in Tora Bora in Afghanistan. We mentioned these pretty ludicrous accusations of Ukraine being run by neo-Nazis and drug addicts. That's highly analogous, in fact, perhaps not even as strong as the false allegations of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and Ireland's involvement in extraordinary rendition, where it is very difficult to prove because, of course, it's a very tightly held secret. But any look at what actually happened, in particular when the Senator Dick Marty did a report on extraordinary rendition, and he made it clear that flights which were being used to transport people from locations where they had been captured to locations where they were being tortured by the CIA, those people were flown through Shannon and Baldonnel. And you say that, perhaps people on the left in Ireland are hanging on to neutrality too tightly. Aren't they right to feel that when somebody, and you were in government, by the way, you were a government minister during a large part of this period, particularly when people were being flown through Shannon to be tortured in black sites in secret prisons in Eastern Europe. Aren't they right to say, hang on a second, we just don't trust the government, that when the American ambassador or whoever calls up the minister and says, make sure that these flights go through on the nod without being searched, they don't trust the government to do that? Aren't they kind of right?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, I mean, lots of planes use Shannon, lots of military planes use Shannon, not just United States. I mean, there's several countries land planes in Shannon, so it's not just open to America and closed to others. The Irish government has always sought assurances with regard to, planes landing, that they would be unarmed, that they would be purposely for landing, for refueling, etc. That was primarily our understanding always. And we asked...
Pause there, just reality check. Billy, just a quick reality check. Knowing what you know. Yeah, assurances are all well and good. Knowing what you know, can you put your hand on your heart and say, on the balance of probabilities, do you think it did or did not happen that people were flown via Baldonnel and Shannon to be tortured by the CIA?
Well, with
give us
the
an answer.
Reports with the reports that came out, I mean, it was clear that there was people transported through Shannon that had their human rights abused in terms
were
of
tortured.
Their fundamental human rights in terms of being shifted from Iraq through Shannon and onto the States. And yes, and there has to be a mechanism, but that you can't say that is a definitive undermining of the neutrality of a country.
No, I'm not saying that. No. I'm trying to establish the facts first, and I think you're acknowledging it, and that's fair enough. But at that time, there were people, I particularly remember, people who were plane spotters. They were, I think, highly motivated plane spotters, but they were plane spotters who were arrested for writing down the registration numbers of planes landing and taking off on Shannon. The Gardaí were very active in that, and they weren't behind the door in any way, making sure that those people felt the full might of the law and were suitably threatened when it displeased the Americans that the flights going through Shannon were just being noted perfectly legally. By the way, those people who were arrested were never charged with anything. The Gardaí weren't nearly so enthusiastic to say that some of these CIA aeroplanes that are owned by shelf companies in Delaware or the Cayman Islands that have no business and have very, very strange paperwork. The Guardian never seemed as interested in checking out what was on those planes as they were in those plane spotters.
Yes, but when you ask a country that is traditionally friendly to Ireland and vice versa for assurances, and those assurances are given, well, then you assume they would be honoured. In the event of there being breaches, there is mechanisms in place. And I can remember in the Dáil those particular issues being raised by many people in good faith. I can remember many protests. We had massive protests in Dublin around the issue of Shannon being used. But when a government asks another government that is generally friendly to it in disposition for assurance, and they're given, well, you ordinarily accept them. In the event of them being found not to be the case, well, then you should use the channels available to you. Well, I mean, you raise it at a level, and you talk to the U.S. ambassador in this case, or the ambassador of any country that is in breach of what we would consider norms around the use of Shannon Airport.
Okay, hold on for a second. When I go through Dublin Airport, I have my suitcase opened, and if I have so much as a bottle of water that's over 100 mils, that'll be fished out and it'll be confiscated off me. Not only were the Americans able to fly through detainees who, even in the planes, were physically restrained in torturous manners, not only were they able to do it, they did it with the absolute confidence that nobody in authority would be interested enough to ask them to open the door to have a look. You know how government works. You've been around the block. You've been a senator, you've been a TD, you've been a minister, now you're an MEP. You know that what happens here is that somebody in the State Department or the American ambassador rings up the minister or their assistant and says, look, here's what's written down, but here's what we want to happen. And that person rings whoever's in charge and they make sure that happens. And aren't people who are sceptical about Ireland moving closer to the Western Military Alliance, aren't they right to say we don't trust the permanent government and indeed many times the elected government in power to operate with sufficient independence, and they let war crimes happen?
Yes, but I mean, we'll just go back to where we are in terms of Shannon being used and the claims made that it was used for rendition flights. Like, I can remember, as I said, those debates. I can also specifically remember even President Bush, I think at the time, declaring openly that they were not being used and gave the Irish government lots of assurances at the time. Now, several
he lied.
Well, at the time, you're given an assurance by the President of the United States of America to a friendly country. You take those assurances.
Well, let me hold for 1 second. Hold for 1 second. I want you to hear a different assurance. This is Sergei Ryabkov, the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister.
Look, I do believe that there is no risk of a larger scale war. We do not want and will not take any action of aggressive character. We will not attack, strike, invade, quote unquote, whatever, Ukraine.
So that's Sergei Ryabkov, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, a couple of weeks before invading Ukraine, saying that they would not invade Ukraine. Why would we believe what you call a friendly country, which is a fair point? Why would we not, though, treat them with as much scepticism as we did this guy? Unless, of course, you're Mick Wallace, who doesn't treat them with any scepticism. But why would reasonable people not be equally sceptical of promises coming from the US?
Well, I mean, certainly rendition flights were in breach of basic human rights. They shouldn't have taken place. I accept that. And I think most people do. But I mean, if you are comparing that with what is now happening in the Ukraine, it's just on a different scale.
No, I'm not. And I want to just to roll back, Billy, I want to be really clear. I'm not comparing those, and I'm not putting them on the same level.
But in terms of the deniability, the deniability of those people that said something would not happen. I mean, the CIA certainly were involved in taking people through Shannon. We had been given lots of assurances. We had asked many times.
Did you believe them?
Well, at the time, yes, I did.
Okay, so if you believe them, pause, Billy. Billy, you said you believe them. Pause on that. Because there is no question that protesters, left-wing people who you might not be so politically friendly with, were subjected to an extraordinary amount of hassle from Gardaí that even the most paranoid anti-vaxxers screaming abuse outside hospitals or politicians' houses are not subjected to. If the permanent government, the Garda upper echelons, the elected government that you were a part of at the time, if they believed the United States, why would they have been hassling those protesters, those plane spotters so much?
Well, I can remember Shannon Watch and others were obviously looking at flights in and out of Shannon the whole time. I can distinctly remember those issues.
Not breaking any law?
Not break any law. I don't think that the arm of the state now was reaching in excessively. I mean, when people breached security parameters, there was certainly arrests and prosecutions in an open court. But in general, I mean, there was massive protests, and those protests were not hampered or stymied from, in any cursory assessment. Overall, the freedom to protest was very much allowed in the vicinity of Shannon and equally on the streets of Dublin.
But why were those people arrested if the institutions of power in Ireland didn't believe what they were saying was true? If you go out in the streets of Russia and wave your Z flag and your white, red and blue flag and say you support Putin and that there's only a special military operation that is there to liberate Ukraine from neo-Nazis, you don't get any hassle. If one teenager holds up an A4 sheet that says stop the war, she will be landed on by dozens of police who will beat the living daylights out of her. The reason she is attacked and the others are not is because she's telling the truth. Can you see that? You're saying that official Ireland believed the assurances from the US. Their behaviour says otherwise.
Well, I mean, people that were arrested were primarily arrested because they were either after threatening to breach a security perimeter or, observing in a restricted zone, for example. I mean, and they would have been tried in a normal court under normal open guise of Irish justice. I don't believe that the state was, oppressively targeting people.
No, neither. I think the degree of oppression there is not comparable to anything that's happening in Russia. And I want to move on from this, but I think it's clear that the reaction of of officialdom made it clear that they did not believe for a moment the assurances that they were getting from the Americans, and it's fairly obvious. And I want to move away from that because I don't want to focus on that too much. And I mentioned, and you said how proud you were about how Ukrainian refugees were being treated in Ireland, and I think in this case that's difficult to deny. Has Ireland always been that good?
Well, I think in general we are reasonably good. Yes, I mean we have taken numbers of refugees from war-torn areas from time to time. I certainly often thought we could have done an awful lot more. I can remember the Syrian crisis, for example, when you had a flow of nearly 1 million people into the European Union. Still, some of those people coming from Syria and from Kurdistan and those particular areas that were, very much a target when they were fleeing ISIS and fleeing other aggression.
Yeah.
Did we do enough? I thought we could have done more. That's my own view. There is a difficulty, of course, in the sense that normally when they were entering into other countries before they were entering into the European Union, and that the almost distasteful practice of using refugees, not a distasteful, it's a disgusting practice of using refugees as a bargaining tool is something I just can't understand. And the European Union itself tried to get to a place where we would all take our fair share. And at the time, we couldn't even get a council agreement. Many countries objected stringently to taking any refugees from Syria, and Germany ended up taking the vast bulk of them at the time. Yes, we could have done more. Yes, we could have done more. But there is now an issue whereby they are coming directly into the European Union over a border from a neighbouring country.
When you were in the Dáil, in the early period of when you were in the Dáil, Fianna Fáil got a fair bit of political capital of essentially kicking left-wing parties over refugees. Your now late colleague Liam Lawler, who disgraced himself in various other ways, also had a penchant for using violent language against refugees and saying things like they should be kicked out. And he particularly made a point of using violent imagery when he referred to refugees. And it's difficult to separate that entirely from the actual violence that was done to refugees on occasion. Are you sure Fianna Fáil has a good record on this?
Well, I was a public representative since 1993. From my perspective, I can safely say that my entire political life I've advocated for asylum seekers, for refugees. We had very contentious issues in my constituency when I was a Dáil TD, very often exploited by people for electoral gain. And I always
no shortages in Fianna Fáil.
And I always stood, I'm in Fianna Fáil too, and I always stood foursquare in support of asylum seekers, refugees, and ensuring that when they came to our shores, that we would try and accommodate them with whatever capacity we had. And I stand proudly knowing that I did that all the time.
Okay. One last thing. I mentioned before we started recording that we don't want to try and break news on this because obviously people listen to the podcast over a longer period and we don't attempt to do breaking news. But there is going to be some outcome to the war in Ukraine. What's it going to be?
Well, look, we're crystal ball gazing into what is now an unfolding horror. A human tragedy beyond belief, a catastrophic event. I still hope that there's enough people that can convince Russia, either through the sanctions, through the fact that the Ukrainian army and the people are putting up huge resistance. I'd like to see China become more vocal in terms of putting pressure on Putin to withdraw from the Ukraine. Longer term, there is going to be some outcome in terms of a peace process. Mm-hmm. And the quicker that happens, the better. I certainly don't want to see the dismantling of the Ukraine and it being divvied up into bits and pieces based on linguistic, ethnic lines. That would be a very dangerous precedent. The Ukraine is a sovereign state, and we must acknowledge the sovereignty of it.
Yeah, okay, but we know that. But one of the outcomes is a long, slow, murderous war. And students of Soviet and Russian imperial history would know that both the Soviet authorities and before them the Tsarist Empire, they had a particular tactic of which we are seeing the effects of still to this day. They had a particular tactic of promoting one particular ethnic group where there was mixed ethnic groups, in particular the weaker or smaller group, in order to balance out and essentially keep two intermingled ethnic groups fighting each other and prevent them from fighting the empire. And this happened in Georgia with Ossetians and Abkhazians, who are minorities in Georgia. This happened with Tatars, both within Russia and within what is now Ukraine, and in a whole host of other areas. Are you completely confident that the Americans are not thinking of doing the same thing and thinking that maybe a long war wouldn't do their interests any harm at all? Because a settlement, would essentially mean that somebody comes out on top. But if the two of them are caught in a murderous war for as long as possible, that suits American interests. Are you comfortable with that?
Well, I don't believe that would be the case, that America would look at it from that perspective. Bear in mind it is a neighbour to many of US allies in terms of NATO countries. So it's neighbouring Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland.
Well, you've expressed, you've expressed misplaced faith in American intentions before. Whether you believe they would do it or not is one thing, but it would, in a very cynical way, be in their interests, because toppling Putin could make Russia incredibly unstable, but keeping him tied up with an unwinnable war would mean that he's contained, doesn't cost them much, and it prevents any messiness in Russia.
No, I don't see that being the case. I just think that the international community, and particularly the European Union and the community that makes up the European Union, wants to see a settlement. There is no way that we want to see a destabilized country of 44 million people, nearly once and a half the size of France, as a neighbour, being systematically destroyed, either by continued Russian attacks or by a civil war being promoted by Russia, for example, in the event of there being, a de-escalation from Russia itself. So, I mean, I certainly believe that there's enough international eyes on Ukraine to try and bring it to a conclusion in terms of a settlement that at least allows Ukraine to survive, and that it is not divvied up and broken up and that consumed into Russia. I certainly don't believe that there's an appetite in the European Union for that. But equally, a long sustained military campaign by Russia will only do one thing, and that will be to destroy more lives and property and infrastructure, and undermine a country as of 44 million people on our borders. And you've now 3.5 million plus people after leaving the Ukraine and coming to the European Union. And if you have a long drawn out war, either being pursued by Russia or a civil war being encouraged by Russia in the event of their withdrawing, well, then it would have, a destabilizing effect in the region. And that's
whatever about destabilizing Ukraine and the region, there's a fair old chance that this will destabilize Russia. It might be Russia that gets torn to pieces over this.
Well, I mean, look, President Putin, and I don't know how he holds power. It's obviously through fear and favor, as we know,
money.
From an autocrat, and money. Yes, fear and favor.
$1 billion a day in fossil fuel payments coming from the EU.
Yes, and I think during the duration of the war, I've said this. I've signed letters calling on the Commission. We should suspend the purchase of coal, oil, and gas from Russia during the duration of the war. Longer term, obviously, we have to accept that it is a fuel source for us for the foreseeable future until we unwind completely from fossil fuels. But we should not be purchasing coal, oil, or gas from Russia while it is killing our neighbours.
Billy Kelleher, Fianna Fáil MEP, I gave you a good questioning. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you.
Okay, William, so we're just finished the interview with Billy Kelleher. You went pretty hard after Billy there. Do you think he was being a hypocrite?
Well, I leave it to the listeners to decide on any description like that, but I really don't think there's a consistency with what he was saying, the way that he's calling for the level of action against Russia and what he was happy to put up with from the Americans. It's not an absolutely equivalent situation. I wouldn't think it is. I wouldn't suggest it is at all. But there's definitely an inconsistency.
And, he didn't go as far as saying, we would join NATO. In fact, he said we would be non-aligned rather than neutral. What do you think that means in practice?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure it means anything in practice. I'm not sure, I probably should have questioned him harder on that. I don't think that actually means anything. It's a distinction without a difference. I think what it is that Ireland being officially neutral has tied the hands of some governments down the years, perhaps in a way that was good that they were tied, I would think. But that has meant that they haven't been as good boys for the Americans as they might have liked to be. And they might be a bit frustrated with that. And I think squeezing some wriggle room into the situation is essentially what they want to do there.
What do you make of his line that, the Americans gave us reassurances that no kidnapped prisoners would be transported through Shannon and Baldonnel and to be tortured?
Yeah, Billy Kelleher has been in politics for 30 years. And, everybody who knows how power works knows that that's nonsense. And whenever somebody stands up and says, I've been given assurances of X, Y, and Z, but they're not willing to put their own name to that particular statement, it's blindingly obvious that they know that it's not true. And everybody at the time knew that that wasn't true, and we have as much proof as we would ever get or would ever need now to know that that wasn't true. But, everybody although they may not have been able to prove it, certainly everybody had a moral certainty that that was just untrue. And as I think I said in the interview, the proof that they knew it wasn't true was that they wouldn't spend any effort at all to inspect the planes at a time when they were harassing anti-war activists and people just standing outside the airport. That's an important point I didn't make in the interview. People who were standing outside the airport in a public place taking note of aircraft registration numbers that were landing and taking off were being pretty severely harassed by Gardaí. Everybody knew what was going on.
I think I'll leave it there then. William Campbell, thank you very much for talking to me.
If you like the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter, but most of all, tell your friends.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter, at Here's How Podcast, and follow Billy Kelleher, at Billy Kelleher EU. And get in touch if you can suggest a guest or topic for the next show. And thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. Their donations allow us to devote time to research and finding interesting guests. And if you can do the same as them and donate €1 or €2 per podcast or per month, please go to patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by William Campbell. The assistant producer is Kevin Wolf.